Shalom WJC family. It's time for our weekly Torah Talk. This week we'll be studying Parshat Yitro and dealing with the question no less important than, does God care about you? Or me? Or us? Or the Jewish people? Or other people? It's a really central question to faith and to Judaism. And the question is, of course, if God cares about us, why do so many horrible things happen? That could be personally when tragedy strikes. It could be on a grander scale, like as we all worry about these captives who are being held in Gaza. I was in Israel last week. Everyone's still heartbroken and reeling and just trying to struggle forward. Does God care? And if God cares, why are all these things happening? So in Parshat Yitro, we have the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. And the first of the 10 Commandments, according to Maimonides and several other of the early commentators, is Ani Adonai Elohecha Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. And what Rambam says, what Maimonides says, is that this command is a command of faith, of emunah. Right? That the purpose of this, you have to believe that there is a God. That this is God talking to you on Sinai, that this is God's voice or the voice of holiness coming through in the Torah. Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I've been studying with one of my chavrusas, Nitivot Shalom, book, an author that asks just amazing, profound questions on the text. And he asks here, we have to believe in God, Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, God who brought us out of Egypt. Shouldn't it say, I believe in God, he asks, who created the world? Shouldn't that be the relevant question? Why talk about the Exodus from Egypt here? Why not say, you have to believe I am the God who created the world? And Nitivot Shalom goes on to highlight exactly what is meant by this insistence on belief in Yitziat Mitzrayim, not belief in being creator of the world. Because what's happening here at Sinai is a particularistic covenant, right? That God and the Jewish people have a special relationship. That's not to say we're the only people that have a special relationship with God. It's not to say that we are better than anybody else. None of that. But that there is a special relationship. And that relationship is established through Yitziat Mitzrayim, through God taking us out of Egypt. The faith of the Jewish people needs to be based on more than God as creator, but in fact on God, Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of the land of Egypt. And what is highlighted by that level of faith, that tenet of faith, says the Nitivot Shalom, not faith in a general creator, not faith in a God who created the world and wound it up like a clock and let it go and we all suffer the consequences. But a God who is active in history, a God who cares. The Nitivot Shalom uses this as a proof text of the concept of Hashgachat Prati, which means that God cares about me and God cares about you and God cares about the Jewish people and God cares about human beings. And that the initial tenet of faith that makes Judaism work is not just that we believe in God who created the world, but that we believe in a God who cares about the Jewish people, who cares about individuals, and being all-powerful has the capacity to do so. It's hard. It's not so easy to believe that all the time, especially when we see terrible things happening in the world, when we see people being held captive in dungeons and tunnels, when we see awful murders taking place. We see victims of wars all over the world, innocent people dying. It strains our belief that God could care. How could a God who cares let this happen? All right, it's a primal question throughout Jewish history, maybe coming to its culmination in the Holocaust, but with the spike in anti-Semitism, with the invasion of Israel on October 7th, and the horrible things that were done to people, to innocent civilians, that can't help but bubble to the surface again now. One of the commentators on this concept that I find to be most meaningful is Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel, of course, created the concept of sort of divine pathos. Divine pathos says that God cares, but God doesn't change the natural order of the world, at least not very often. And so what does God do? God sends messengers, right? The prophets. This was Heschel's interpretation of the prophets, where that they came to express the divine pathos, that every act of injustice, that every act of making a person feel less than dignified, that every every act of one people taking advantage of another, or one person taking advantage of another, that God recognizes all of them and that they make God angry. That God has pathos, they make God sad, that God is with us in our indignation, that God is with us in our sorrow, that God is with us in the pit, like Joseph, or like the kidnapped victims from October 7th, the captives being held in Gaza. God is with us in our pain and our sorrow. And even in Egypt, God was with us. Remember, we were slaves for hundreds of years. How could God let that happen? God comes to Moses and said, I heard the cries of your people, and now I'm ready to let them out. Well, where were you for the hundreds of years that we were slaves to Pharaoh, the hundreds of years where they were committing genocide on Jewish babies, throwing Jewish male babies into the river? You were with us? Yeah, it seems to be that God was with us. That God may not act always, but we are not alone. That emotional connection with God, God's caring, Hashgachat Pratit, God's caring about you and me and the Jewish people and all people and other peoples, and entering into special relationships with people and with peoples, that is God's caring. And while the natural order of the world may not be able to be changed, while evil people will still do evil things, while the way of the world, the terrible storms and earthquakes and diseases that seem to affect people haphazardly, no matter who they are, that is how the world works, perhaps how it must work. But whatever is happening in our lives, we never need to feel alone. Why? Because Ani Hashem Elohecha, Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Because I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. You are never alone. Doesn't mean everything's going to be wonderful all the time, that bad things are never going to happen, that we're not going to feel pain or sorrow, that people we love are not going to suffer or perhaps die. That those are the way of the world. But we know that they will never be alone when they do. And that when we stand with them and we comfort them and we hold them close, that we are representing, just like the prophets of so long ago, God in the world. That we can be representatives of that divine pathos, that when we are angry, when we are sad, when we are joyful, when wonderful things happen, that when we do that with religious purpose, when we do that with a connection to our emunah, that is the First Commandment, that we believe there is a God and that God cares, that God cared enough to take us out of the land of Egypt, and more importantly, cared enough to be with us when we were exiled in the land of Egypt, when we were exiled for thousands of years. And even now, even today, with these captives who are in exile, God is with them, just like our hearts are with them, just like our souls are with them. And in that togetherness, hopefully we can will a better future together. Shabbat Shalom.